Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to get started. And I'd like to begin today with by acknowledging that we're gathering on the ancestral, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, who have long been the stewards of this land, caring for the Ottawa River and its tributaries through a reciprocal relationship with the natural world that continues to sustain this place today. We honor their lasting connection to the land, the wisdom they have shared, and the contributions that they continue to make. As an uninvited guest here, I'm especially mindful of the privilege it is to gather on this land. And as we enter today's conversation, I invite you to reflect on your connection to the land, the relationships that stem from that connection, and how those interconnections shape your commitments to calls to action and calls for justice for and alongside Indigenous people. My name is Misha Khan. I work at the National Right to Housing Network, and I'll be moderating your session today. I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Cecile Kotyk, who is the founder and principal consultant at Kotyk Consulting, an assistant professor and design justice research chair at the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Misha. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm 2 hours behind being in Calgary, so I'm trying to still wake up. I usually don't take coffee, but I had to take coffee this morning. So we'll see if I'm really wired or if I'm still sleepy. But thanks for having me. My name is Dr. Cecile Kotyk, but I go by Cecile. And as Misha said, I'm an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture at the University of Calgary, as well as a design justice research chair. And what does that mean? It's looking at spatial inequities in our built environment and how design processes continue to impact marginalized and racialized communities. And so today I'll be presenting the final completed project, which was my doctoral research, which I just completed this summer. And this is my third. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And this is my third presentation at this conference. I've walked attendees through the entire process when I was doing my doctoral research. So today I'll be presenting the outcome, and is entitled Seeing in Color, a Black Housing Equity Framework to Address Anti-Black Racism in Housing and Homelessness. So my presentation outline, I'll talk about introduction, the research project objectives, as well as the purpose. I'll contextualize it by drawing on Canadian Black history and Black homelessness in Canada, and I'll move on to the research results and the research outcome, which is the Black Housing Equity Framework, and conclude my presentation. So discrimination against Black people in Canada is deeply entrenched and normalized in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices, and it usually goes unnoticed to those who do not feel its effects. And this type of racism and discrimination is uniquely rooted in European colonization in Africa, as well as the transatlantic slave trade, the legacy of transatlantic slave trade in Canada. And slavery was legalized in 1834. However, 2 centuries later, these racist ideologies that were established during that time in history continue to drive processes of racism and discrimination against Black Canadians. And today we find that Black Canadians experience social inequities and housing inequities that are linked to processes of racism and discrimination at numerous levels: interpersonal, societal, institutional, organizational. We also find that housing continues to remain Eurocentric in its approach, further marginalizing Black communities. And so my research really looks at the role anti-Black racism plays in creating housing instability for Black individuals. And just to preface this, I've worked in housing and homelessness for about 15 years. So I've worked directly with individuals experiencing housing challenges and worked my way up to leadership positions where I helped influence policy. So based on that background, it was what kind of led me in this direction in studying the challenges that Black communities face. And so my research is to introduce a paradigm shift, and I look at 2 objectives. The first is to understand the impact of systemic anti-Black racism. And the second, especially with my program being a practice-based program, is to now develop a framework or a tool that practitioners can use to address anti-Black racism. With the understanding that a tool or a framework such as this cannot end anti-Black racism. It takes all of us. However, it's a tool that we can use to help guide equitable policies and practices. And the purpose is really twofold. The first is to raise awareness. Given the lack of research, and it was quite interesting to see the lack of research and data available on Black experiences when it comes to housing, and not just in the housing sector, across other sectors like healthcare, education, justice, and so on. So this research is really to raise our level of awareness and to provide this tool that address discriminatory policies and practices and help guide policymakers, decision makers, housing practitioners to develop more equitable policies, practices, and programs to meet the needs of Black Canadians. And before I move on, it's important for us to have a shared understanding of the terminologies that I use in my research and I'm presenting today. And the first is anti-Black racism. When you talk about anti-Black racism, we think that it's just racism between two individuals. However, Dr. Akwa Benjamin talks about how anti-Black racism is policies and practices that's embedded in Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce attitudes, and discrimination directed at people of African descent. And that's rooted in their experiences of enslavement and colonization here in Canada. As I continue to dive deep into this research, it was important for me to ground it and to look at theoretical frameworks that help me make sense of the issue of racism and the intersection between race, racism, and housing. So I had identified critical race theory. Some of you may be familiar with critical race theory. Who has heard about critical race theory? Perfect. Yeah, so it's looking at critical race theory to help me make sense of the issues that we're experiencing in Canada. So critical race theory was established in the US as a legal framework, and it started in the 1970s to 1980s. However, we've seen that there's a lot of applicability to the Canadian context and across different disciplines. And so critical race theory is a discourse that recognizes that systemic racism and white supremacy are a part of Western life. And it's also a practice that challenges them in this context. So it's important to note that critical race theory is not just a discourse, but it also provides us with the tools that we need to challenge the status quo and to challenge oppressive systems in the Canadian society. So my research methodology, this was kind of a fun part, in a sense, to try to figure out what kind of methodologies have been used to address issues like this. And again, it's quite outstanding to see that Canada is really behind the ball in terms of understanding the role of whether it be anti-Asian racism or anti-Black racism. So developing a research methodology was a bit difficult to figure out what methodological approaches that would be more applicable to this research. However, I was able to identify a number of methodologies and merge them together. So the research really used a multi-method approach, including Afrocentric research methodology, given the nature of this research, autoethnographic research methodology, so pulling on my lived and living experiences of racism, housing challenges, as well as my professional expertise, and design science research methodology, given that I'm in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape. And all of this was really oriented and grounded in lived experience. So I ensured that I was engaging and developing relationships with individuals in the shelter system, and I was able to partner with Calgary Drop-In Center, which they were incredibly instrumental in helping me recruit individuals for this research. I also looked at another group of research contributors, which are called key informants. And key informants are seen as individuals in professional settings who are challenging anti-Black racism and mobilizing to change things, make the landscape more equitable for us. So I interviewed people in the shelter system as well as key informants from across Canada to really gain a more nuanced understanding of the role of systemic anti-Black racism and how we should be addressing it in our sectors, as well as leveraging this by engaging with my community of practice partners. And so research review, of course, with every research, most research, literature review was conducted to understand Black history and its prevailing legacies. So it was important for me to look at, especially since I was using Afrocentric research methodology, to really look at a particular African philosophy called Sankofa, which enables us to look back at our past to understand the inequities, the current inequities that we're experiencing as communities. And so I was able to look at the historical context, and I highlighted some of the challenges and the practices and events that have occurred in history that paved the way for the contemporary inequities that we're experiencing today. And the first is the first African in Canada. It's important to note that people of African descent have been in Canada for about 400 years. And I state this because when we're collecting data, especially with the pit count, when I was in practice, I would ask, well, why aren't we collecting data on Black experiences? And I'm told, well, they fall under refugee and immigrant population. So it's that misconception that every Black person is an immigrant or a refugee. So it's discounting the diversity that exists within Black communities in Black Canadians and African Caribbean diaspora. And slavery. It's always important to note that slavery happened in Canada. A lot of the times, especially when I teach the students, I ask about slavery, and a lot of them don't know that there was slavery in Canada. They think it was the US and Canada saved the slaves in the US through the Underground Railway. So it's important to highlight that slavery was actually authorized by King Louis XIV, which enabled thousands of people of African descent to be enslaved in both colonies, the British and the French colonies. And these colonies bought and sold them like property. They exploited them for labor. They also subjected them to all forms of violence and abuse, such as psychological, physical, reproductive, and sexual abuse. And although slavery was abolished in 1834, it didn't stop these racist ideologies to continue to exist, impacting Black communities. And as my research looks at how practices perpetuate anti-Black racism, it's important to also look at how policies are also maybe intentionally or unintentionally perpetuating anti-Black racism. So looking at our history, it's important to look at racial segregation in Canada. And to be quite frank, as an immigrant to Canada, I was shocked to see racial discrimination. Again, it's that perception that, it happened in the States, there was no Jim Crow laws here and nothing like that. And so it was important for me to highlight this and see that Black Canadians have been systematically segregated and denied access to education, employment, housing, transportation, commercial establishments, and to also look at the role that universities played in this. And I found that universities such as the House University, McGill University, University of Toronto, all had policies banning Black people from applying and getting accepted to nursing and medical programs. As we know, those programs they command a certain type of income. So banning individuals from access to these types of programs limits their ability for financial stability. And so it was also important to note that, and this came as a surprise to me, that the last segregated school in Canada closed in 1983 in Nova Scotia. How many of us knew this information? See, not a lot of us. So it's important to understand that Black people were systematically segregated across all sectors and prevented from becoming full citizens in Canada. And as well as looking at the makeup, the population of Canada, especially what we hear a lot about anti-immigration rhetoric, right? Especially blaming immigrants for everything that's happening. And it was important to look at, well, what has happened in the past? And identified that we had anti-Black immigration laws that were passed, which Immigrant Act barring Black immigrants from entering Canada, and this happened between 1910 to 1967. However, we still have discriminatory policies that impact Black Canadians from immigrating here and also flourishing in Canada as well. So as a planner, it was important for me to understand the role that urban planning, architecture, landscape, the built environment profession played in really inciting racism towards Black Canadians. And I found that urban planning has historically and systematically contributed to the racial segregation and displacement of Black communities in Canada. Certain urban planning tools, such as urban renewal schemes, were used to incite anti-Black racism, displacing Black communities, such as Africville in Nova Scotia and Hogan's Alley. Africville is also a prime example of redlining in Canada as well. And we know that Black Canadians have always mobilized and fought for change, and we continue to do so today. So the history of Black people in Canada is really marked by ongoing racial inequities that persist in present day. Although there is limited data, digging through, trying to figure out, well, what is Black history like, or Black homelessness like in the Canadian context? But I was able to find that Black Canadians are overrepresented across sectors, and we can see some of the causes of homelessness, anti-Black racism and discrimination have fueled disparities in the child and welfare systems, education, employment, healthcare, justice, and housing. And in education, we see that discrimination within the education system results in youth experiencing fewer opportunities to pursue higher education, and this perpetuates the cycle of poverty and really paves the way for homelessness. And so gathering all this information led to the realization that for Black Canadians, homelessness is a result of various racially inequitable systems that have been perpetuated by anti-Black racism through our policies and our practices. And so now on to my research results. Now we've understood the context in which we're dealing with. And now, so the research results, like I talked about, it was important for me to really engage Black individuals in the shelter system. And using design science research methodology, it's an iterative process, which requires that you center the voices and perspective of individuals experiencing these issues at the forefront of your research. So you engage with them at the beginning to gain those insights and those nuances as to how racism impacts or if racism impacts your housing stability. And then you take that information, the data that you collected, you analyze it, you start developing the framework based on that information, and you go back to them for concluding insights. So you're engaging them throughout the process to make sure that it is actually in line with what they have said, and how you're interpreting it actually is aligned with the stories and narratives coming out of the communities. So this research results really showed that it was really meant to understand those nuances, and it really showed the intersection between race, racism, and housing, but also how systemic anti-Black racism is insidious and pervasive, that actually leads and is a precursor to housing stability for Black Canadians. And I wanted to share their stories today to really honor them. As I engaged with individuals in the shelter system, they talked about how some of them have experienced chronic homelessness, so 20 plus years in the shelter system, but they've never been engaged. These research projects haven't engaged them particularly to understand what the unique barriers they're experiencing are. So it was important for me to really honor them and highlight their story, because it talks about how their encounters with anti-Black racism is across sectors, in the justice system, in education, in employment, in healthcare, as well as housing. Individuals in the shelter system talk about how racial profiling is very prevalent and how it's impacted their ability to exit homelessness or even to maintain jobs. In education, we found that Black individuals experience negative stereotypes that impact their ability to progress in educational institutions. In employment, we know about racism that occurs against Black individuals within the workforce. And in healthcare, this was particularly interesting because there was an individual that was in the middle of, through the transition process, and she talked about how she was experiencing a lot of difficulties, a lot of anxiety, depression, also suicidal ideation, and how she tried to access mental health support. But because of the lack of representation and the lack of culturally appropriate programs and services to understand the difficulties of being a Black individual in transition, she wasn't able to access those services that she needed. And unfortunately, her untreated mental health challenges led her to lose her job. And eventually, of course, losing her apartment, landing her in the shelter for the first time. And this is an incredibly intelligent individual that's able to advocate for herself. But because of the systemic barriers, she was unable to access the help that she needed at the time that she needed it, which caused her to end up in the homeless shelter for the first time. And then when it came to housing discrimination was also a major barrier for exiting homelessness. Individuals talked about how even when they're experiencing homelessness, it was hard to exit the situation, because when they went out to potential landlords, they were discriminated based on numerous levels. First, against them because of their race, and then of course their address, being that they lived in the shelter, and then their source of income, really impacting their ability to exit the current situation they were in. Individuals also talked about even when housed, racism impacted their ability to maintain housing. An individual specifically talked about how even when housed, they would have their neighbors always complaining about them based on racial profiling, talking about how they're loud and they're aggressive, even if they're not doing those things, and calling the police on them, which unfortunately caused them to get evicted. and their family getting displaced and based on their age, going in separate directions. And so my next slide is a video, and this is quite emotional because this is of a story of an individual that I got to know through this process, and unfortunately the individual passed. But I really wanted to, as we talked about the research and their experiences, I really wanted to honor his story because he really gave me a better perspective of how anti-Black racism can shape an individual's trajectory right from childhood up until adulthood. So it's important for me to really highlight the pervasive, insidious nature of anti-Black racism and how our actions or inactions impact an individual's life. So I'll play it. Meet Ikena. Ikena grew up in a two-parent household. At the age of 6, his mother took him off to kindergarten to start his schooling. Ikena was in class with white and Asian children. However, in school, some of the white and Asian children made fun of his skin color, saying things like, "Ew, why is your skin so dark?" Ikena was deeply hurt by these comments, but had no one to turn to for support. The bullying continued, and one day, Ikena defended himself against a kid who called him a black monkey, told him to go back to where he came from, and even shoved him. Ikena punched the kid, and as a result, the teachers suspended him, labeling him as aggressive and violent. Years passed, and Ikena found himself struggling in school. He felt that the teachers were treating white students better than he and his fellow Black students. Even when he asked for help, the teachers were unresponsive, telling him to go do it yourself. Ikena felt like he didn't belong in school, and eventually he dropped out at the young age of 15. As a result of his lack of education, Ikena had difficulty finding meaningful employment and kept running into trouble with the justice system. Ikena stated,
"The policing is really bad. I have been in multiple situations where me and my friends are driving. A cop will be driving in a different direction and see us and turn around, stop us and search us. Call the gang unit. Every time there are like 10 cop cars stopped and searching us. And then they let us go when they don't find anything. On other occasions, they will just stop us and ask our names, even if it's illegal. If we don't give it to them, then they put us in a cell for 24 hours and then let us go." He felt trapped in the system with a curfew and frequent check-ins from the police, making it impossible for him to work. Eventually, he lost his job and ended up homeless, leading to his arrest and imprisonment. Tragically, Ikena died in jail at the age of 28. Unfortunately, Ikena is an example of the school-to-prison pipeline. According to Bernard and Smith 2018, the school-to-prison pipeline has been used to refer to the disciplinary policies and patterns of socialization utilized within school settings to differentially target minority students, particularly African Canadian males, away from educational success and toward incarceration. Okay, so this story is based on actual events and really shows and highlights the life-changing consequences of racism and the need for us to address this, especially being now an academic. It's important for us to look at housing, not just as an issue in the housing sector, but look at it from a systemic point of view and look at how each system feeds into each other and how they converge, impacting Black communities. And so it's important for me to highlight his story, to really honor him and his contributions to the research. And so the results of my research led to the development of a framework called the Black Housing Equity Framework. Sorry, I'm trying to pick myself back up after the video. It's called the Black Housing Equity Framework. And the Black Housing Equity Framework, it's important to note that this is a starting point.
it's a point in which for us to raise our level of awareness and for us to commit to addressing systemic anti-Black racism in our organizations and in our practices, in our policies or lack of policies. So the Black Housing Equity Framework is a strategic approach to understanding the historical context and how it impacts us today, as well as understanding the contemporary inequities that impact Black communities. It's meant to be utilized to minimize discriminatory policies and practices, and it provides a set of guiding principles that aligns with Black communities and a three-phase process that has operational questions to help guide policymakers, housing practitioners through the process of developing equitable policies, practices, programs, and services. But most importantly, it centers on the voices and perspectives of Black individuals. And so what to keep in mind when using the Black Housing Equity Framework? Black history. A lot of times we say, well, it's in the past. It doesn't impact us today. But it does, very much so. And we saw the history, how overt it was, how the racism was very overt and in our face. However, it continues today, but more covertly, more hidden, and disguised and manifests as microaggression, and so on and so forth. It's also important to understand how white supremacy appears in organizations and how racial biases influence policies and practices. It's important to also understand how oppression happens and how to dismantle systems of oppression. And Black experiences, as I talked about, Black communities are incredibly diverse and unique in their experiences, so it's important to understand that we're not monolithic or homogeneous. Black people who lived and live in experiences and key informants were consulted to identify guiding principles that could help guide our practice and that aligns with Black communities. And so some of the principles include understanding Black history, addressing anti-Black racism, using a love-centered approach, because Black communities have been subjected to intergenerational trauma and continue to be subjected to racial trauma. And it's important that our approaches be compassionate, be empathetic, and understanding. Intersectional approach, understanding how different identities would impact a person's experiences with our policies, our practices, our services. Trauma-informed approach, as we're all familiar with. Strength-based approach, recognizing how resilient Black communities are and how we hold the knowledge and the solutions, and it's important for us to be centered and amplified, and for our voices to be amplified in the process. And of course, accountability and collection of disaggregated race-based data to inform our policies and practices. Utilizing the Black Housing Equity Framework is a three-phase iterative process, and this includes co-design, co-implement, and co-evaluate. And if you notice how I talk about so throughout the process, Black individuals are engaged, and they're the ones, we're co-initiating the initiatives with them, we are co-evaluating it, we're co-implementing it with these individuals. And so the co-design phase, so each phase, I said it's iterative, so it's not a linear process. And so it's important to understand that when we get to certain phases, if we haven't addressed the issue, we need to be going back to make sure that we're actually addressing the issue and implementing initiatives that create positive housing outcomes for Black individuals. And so each phase has operational questions. And the creation of this framework was data collected from research contributors, but also based on my experiences as a practitioner in terms of what could we utilize, what could we include in a framework that helps provide even a step-by-step process to help guide policymakers and practitioners. And so the first is the co-design phase. And this co-design phase involves collaborating with Black communities and stakeholders to develop policies and practices. And the first is self-reflect. And it's important to understand that we've been conditioned to see Black communities, Black individuals through a lens of stereotypes. So this impacts how we develop policies, who is included in the process and who's excluded in the process. So it's important for us to self-reflect on how our biases or prejudices can impact how we develop policies or not develop policies in this case. And then purpose. What is the purpose of the initiative? Is it something that was initiated by an organization, or is it something that was co-initiated or brought up by the community? And how do we work with the community? And then the third step is partner involvement, ensuring, again, the centering of Black communities in this process, and information gathering. A lot of the times as planners, I was at Ontario Professional Planners Institute's conference, and when we talk about engaging, I would hear people say, well, I collected data. But it's important to understand that, and maybe from the census or whatever source of data you're collecting, but it's important to understand that there is that lack of data on Black experiences. So we have to go out to these communities, we have to build those relationships, we have to foster those relationships and build trust with those communities and engage them in collecting the data to inform our initiatives. And the co-implement phase really follows a two-step process and provides guidance as to how to implement and formulate these initiatives and actions. And it looks at identifying the best course of action, the best initiative that would address these disparities that we're seeing, and making the decision with the community as to what initiative would really align with the community and meet their needs. And the last phase is co-evaluate, which really talks about how do we evaluate our initiatives. Does it actually meet the needs of them? Is it actually producing the outcomes that we intended for it to produce? How do we hold ourselves accountable? Viability and sustainability. How are we building ongoing capacity with community to ensure that they're continuously engaged? And the last step is reflect on outcomes, reflecting on the whole process. How are we going to do things differently? How are we going to ensure that we are continuing to build those relationships with Black communities? And so as looking at the different levels of racism, how it interacts, this diagram illustrates the different levels at which racism can exist in organizations and how it manifests at each level. And these key insights from my doctoral research provides examples of actions to take and prompts to assist practitioners in addressing racism. And so, for instance, some of the key insights that I found for the personal level is that even within racialized communities, we can perpetuate anti-Black racism. So it's important for us to be aware of this and to hold ourselves accountable as to how we're perpetuating it. Even within Black communities, we can perpetuate lateral violence. And this shows as lateral violence and power hoarding. So these are key insights that came out of the research. And at an interpersonal level, it's important to understand that racism is normalized. If you look at social media, and you look at comments in some of these, especially news articles that involve people of color, you would see how normalized racism is, and people don't even see it as racism. But it's important for us to understand that, again, we've been conditioned to think a certain way when it comes to racialized communities. And so we need to be addressing these biases and understanding how that could impact how we engage with Black communities. And of course, organizational levels. Understanding the key insight is racist ideologies that are embedded in our policies and practices, and we've talked about this throughout the process already. And so implementing the Black housing equity framework really necessitates a fundamental change in mindset and professional practice principles. And it mandates prioritizing specific ethos when engaging with Black communities to deconstruct systemic housing barriers and establish equitable policies and practices. And an example of an ethos and competencies for housing practitioners is highlighted in this table. And it talks about what are the principles that should guide our practices, and how do we know? What are our roles in terms of knowing, being, and doing? So it looks at different levels. What do we know in terms of Black history, how that impacts our policies and practices, and what do we do? Actions speak louder than words. It's how are we actually mobilizing this knowledge into action? And then being, who are we as people? How do we ensure that we continue to dismantle these systems of oppression? And how do we hold ourselves accountable and as well as others accountable? And then it states some of the possible outcomes that can come from that. And the outcome for utilizing the Black housing equity framework includes introducing a paradigm shift to facilitate Black inclusion, understanding the importance of centering Black perspectives, potentially reducing discrimination and inequities in housing and services for Black communities, promoting greater awareness and sensitivity, as well as raising awareness on policy gaps and design and delivery and the need to address these. It has a potential to create safe spaces where Black individuals can educate us as practitioners and help in the process of creating equitable policies and practices. And of course, the ultimate outcome is for us to ensure that it has the potential to improve housing outcomes and housing access for Black communities. And so in conclusion, this research on anti-Black racism in the Canadian housing and homelessness sector has illuminated the critical and pervasive issue of systemic anti-Black racism that demands improved and sustained action. It has showed how systemic anti-Black racism acts as a precursor to housing instability for Black Canadians, and addressing this insidious issue necessitates comprehensive strategies involving systems and policies, education and awareness, active community involvement and collaboration, as well as tailored culturally appropriate supports and services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Can we get another round of applause for Marie? And just a reminder that we'll be hosting the joint Q&A session at the very end of today, so just save whatever questions you have towards the end. And I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Denise Gilliard, the Vice Chair of the Down the March Community Land Trust. Do you want to come up?
Thank you so much. Can I just be myself? You better be careful. I wear many hats, the first of which one is a pastor. But no, I'll back up, that's a second hat. The first hat is that I'm a junior elder. Say it with me, junior elder. I'm 63 years old. My grandson, my newest grandchild, is 18 days old. I feel so proud and emotional. Can I just be a mother for a minute? When I was going to school, there was no one like you. I was by myself. I am so overwhelmed and proud today. I don't know if I can keep it together. This is my dream come true. I am Canadian, and my family roots are, mommy is Scotian. Anybody here from Nova Scotia? Okay, Churro, the Marsh. My daddy, has passed away, was Jamaican. So I'm either the best and the brightest or the baddest and the worst. It depends on who you talk to. So I come today with my grandparents from Nova Scotia. My grandparents are with me. And my auntie, Lynn Jones, and my uncle, Rocky Jones, who are activists in the community. And I come with my father, who was 13 when he came to Canada, to Oakville. I was born in Oakville. People used to ask, where are you born? And we never wanted to say, oh, my dad was Jamaican. Where are you from? So we'd say, here. Well, where are your parents from? Here. Where are they from? Toronto Island. You know, we used to make up all kinds of things, but on my mom's side. And I'm thankful and grateful to all of you. I want to thank Nisha for being a fantastic facilitator. She's going to be moving my slides so that I can think, right? And I want to, I have honored Dr. Cecile, she likes to go vibe. Thank you. Thank you for freeing me up so I can just tell our story. I don't have to do all the technical things. So I had this really good what to expect slide. You like it? Looks cool. some of it has been done. So I'm freed up, totally freed up. So I'm going to do what preachers do good and bad, and that is I'm going to adapt because I don't have to exactly do it the way that I thought I did. Because, when you've been given the best meal, you can just be the icing or the dessert. So I think I'll be the dessert. And I'll tell our story of down the marsh. Thank you. Nova Scotians have been here. We even have T-shirts that say, "We've been here," right? Members and descendants of 52 historic land-based communities in the Mi'kmaq territory as early as 1605. We can argue together whether we're 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th generation Canadian. It depends on, what happened and how you came and who you connected with. A lot of Aboriginal and First Nations people, my grandmother was a Gabriel. So we've been here. Black loyalists, Black refugees, Jamaican Maroons. You see, my dad couldn't help himself. When he met my mom, there was that connection. They hired the Maroons to go and beat up on the Nova Scotians who weren't behaving properly. But when the men came and saw how nice they were, they just came together. So I might be a double Maroon in the authenticity of Nanny. Makes us a little dangerous to the status quo. The African Nova Scotian presence in Truro dates back to before the 18th century. Truro has 3 distinct historic communities. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Black communities, still locally known as the Marsh, the Hill, and the Island. And the Marsh was a thriving and vibrant Black community where residents and families owned their own homes and properties. That's the people that I come from down on the Marsh. So our Down the Marsh Community Land Trust aims to establish Black-led community land trusts for African Nova Scotians and other families who have been pushed to the margins through systems of racism, discrimination, gentrification, economics of inequality. A community land trust is a Black model, and lots of people don't know that because there's land trusts, where the land is owned by a nonprofit. It's cooperatively bought and purchased, and then people can own their own homes on that land and be set up for success with support. So it's a kind of a community land-based model where you can build intergenerational wealth and restore that which was taken. The Marsh is the proposed site of our first building and where we'd like to go. African Nova Scotians have an experience with housing vulnerability.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back. No more, no more, no more. They hate you here. Your family's poor. Can't get yourself an education. They don't respect the legislation. So unemployment is your destination. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back. No more, no more, no more. Your parents are gone now, and the corner store. And as for the homestead, well, your family is still poor. It's gone now. The new codes you can't afford. Hit the road, Jack. There's no reason to come back. No more, no more, no more. Your community is still here fighting what they started fighting for. They still hate you down home here. Some are fighting for your rights. We're making progress slowly, but the end is nowhere in sight. A lot of attitudes are still the same. Not much changed since you left, except your family's growing here. There's kinfolk you ain't met. They pushed you to the edges, to the margins and beyond. Called your home a blight. You're worth a burden. Your dreams they never saw. But now it's time for you to claim the place you had to leave. Take back the parts they pushed away, to heal, to love, to breathe. To reconnect to kinfolk. It's time for your return. To face the pain you ran from when you left and watched it burn. The elders' wisdom fades away. The youth must rise and grow. They need all of our strength right now. Come back, there's seeds to sow. You're the vision, you're the dream, you're the hope to start anew. You're the key that holds tomorrow and the light we still pursue. Our future generations, we have so much work to do. So please, hit the road, Jack. Come back, we're calling you home.
Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, this is Angela Bowden, Down the Marsh Community Lands Trust Capacity Manager. Could you give her some more love? The Marsh was a thriving community, thriving, vibrant Black community where residents and families owned their own homes and they owned their own properties. The community lived in an intimate relationship with nature and the prominent river that ran through. While some of that land was given intentionally, bad lands, marsh. Who wants to live in a marsh in Canada, in a cold province? Come on, somebody. They were given that land on purpose, sent there so that they could die, but they thrived. And while they faced seasonal flooding, I could show you pictures of my grandmother's house surrounded with water like it was a moat. And also my mother tells the experience of her house burning down at least 6 to 8 times. They were so calm about it because you're trying to keep warm in the winter. So you have coal stoves, wood stoves. The house burns down, you get 2 things: the baby, because they had lots of children, or the elder. And you made sure people were outside and you watched it burn down. And what did you do? You built it up again. They had seasonal flooding. Their resourcefulness and resiliency and adaptability enabled them to overcome all challenges. Mainstream technological advances in water management increased the desirability of the marsh to outside developers, and they began to crowd the area. Their development put stress on the ecological situation of the land and displaced challenges by displacing residents of the marsh who were not financially able to absorb the new associated costs. This hardship, compounded with the systematic racism, environmental racism, and discriminations that we heard about in Dr. Cecile's presentation, made it difficult for residents to cope and stay in place. Consequently, residents face dispossession of land and housing, loss of their homes and community, displacement and structure, and young people left. They left what we call down home to come to places like Toronto and out west. And as I said, I was born in Oakville. My Nova Scotian mom left as a teenager to find a better life in another part and leave the family's lands. So, Down the Marsh Community Land Trust aims to establish a Black community land trust for African Nova Scotians and other families who have been pushed to the margins through the things that we discussed. The Community Land Trust will both in process and in product claim reparations in the form of land, property, community building, and intergenerational wealth. That is what we're all about. And I'm just gonna ask you to note that we have a broad strategy that could consider the unique barriers to housing experience of Nova Scotians of African descent. Nova Scotia's Affordable Housing Commission report named this, and they talked about collaborating with African Nova Scotians to build mutual trust and target solutions. So we're right on the cusp of that. And I want to also acknowledge that across Black communities in Nova Scotia, there's a land trust movement. There's about 5 or 6 different communities working on this model and trying to bring it to fruition. Some have land, some don't have land, some have land promised, and we're looking to break ground. There's a lot of work to be done. I'd like to talk about those barriers really quickly. As you look at our slide, we've talked about some of these things, but you'll see that there's a lack of clear title to land. In other words, people have the land, have lived on the land, but back in the day, someone say the day, you didn't always get the paperwork, right? But it's their land. We talked about environmental racism, gentrification. It's a great place to live, and so you take it over. Systematic barriers that results in housing discrimination, housing markets policies, they're not race or gender neutral, lack of housing data. These are things Dr. Cecile was talking about, and these are things that are lived experiences down home. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we believe that a community land trust is a tool that can be used, and it's a tool that transforms. It's a reparations framework. We need and demand to have that land back into the hands of the people that it was intended for, that owned it, that have nurtured it all these years and centuries, really. It is our land in that way. So Down the Marsh Community Land Trust, as you look at our history, our very brief history of who we are, the founder of the idea is my auntie, Dr. Lynn Jones, a longtime activist. She does not like when you talk about her, not because she's hiding, but because it is for the community. And she is putting her money where her mouth is, in that she owns our grandmother's family land, and she's selling it or giving it to the land trust at an extremely reduced, below market rent rate. Right? She's a senior and she has to live, but that is not where she'll get her wealth from. And we will take that land, and as a family, just because one person owns the land doesn't mean you all don't think you own. That's grandma's house still in our minds. But as a family, we buy in, we have bought in. We're part of the solution and not the problem. We want to develop housing on there, and we want it to be collectively owned. We are very serious about building wellness, wealth, and wholeness for African Nova Scotia, and our initial goal is to get that land purchased. Oh, and there's others who are in the marsh who have allowed us to work with them to take over that land for the land trust, and we want to build a high quality, someone say high. High quality, affordable housing for African Nova Scotians who have historical roots and other Black households. And so if you look at why we're doing this, besides the historical, we are looking for specific outcomes. The preservation of properties, the reclamation of properties, and the land that, we want that land taken off the market. There's some land that belongs to the community that is on the market that will go to others. We want it taken off and put into the land trust. We want to create and provide housing. We want to mobilize the community. There is a lot of capacity building. And Dr. Cecile, I want to thank you for naming the fact that I would say we've ingested some of the stories about ourselves and some of the practices, and that takes a lot of education, heart transformation, and the work to change how we even look at ourselves. And can we trust ourselves, for instance, to own community land? And then people, just convincing and getting our community's minds and hearts that yes, we can. Remember that line? Yes, we can. Can you say it with me? Yes, we can. And home and community, we want to deal with reparations. People hear the word and start to get scared. No, we want to be able to teach, we want to be able to educate, we want to community build, and we want people to be proud of their heritage. Then we need to educate key stakeholders and influencers, our politicians, our teachers, our preachers, and the whole community. So it is such a joy to share with you, and hopefully all of you got a brochure. If not, we have more. The vision and mission of our organization: housing and community assets that build wellness, wealth, and wholeness for African Nova Scotians. Our mission is to create thriving African Nova Scotian communities by developing collectively owned land assets. Isn't that exciting? That's who we are. Come on now, somebody. Our values, our values are recognitions, an Afrocentric lens, collaboration. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. Sustainability and integrity. That is Down the Marsh Community Land Trust. I'd like to call Angela to close us off, and I'd like to thank you so much for listening. We need help. We need support. We need, however it is you do it. If you want to send good vibes up, and I am not against prayer, but we need action on the ground. And Dr. Cecile, I'm going to be bothering you. We need people who will advise, right, on how we do this. Give some love to Angela as we close.
Home from a shack. I don't know how they did it, but I'm so glad they did. Raised large families with 8 to 12 kids, fed everyone, put clothes on each one's back, taught them to love, provided a home from a shack.
Come on.
Prayed for a change, saw no change in sight, but faithful on their knees, trusted God in the night, and they rose in the morning with God on their mind, leaving vengeance to Him while their spirits stayed kind. And I don't know how they did it. I just don't know how they absorbed all that pain while their heads were unbowed, and somehow they got through it. They got through it somehow, trusting God always, then and now. Their faith was unwavering in His reign. Their benevolence enchanting, and their pain, oh, their pain, was for a future they envisioned. None of it was in vain. The definition of courage, the epitome of brave. And I don't know how they did it, but I'm so glad they did it.
Thank you so much, Denise. I'd like to open it up to everyone for asking any questions you have. And you can ask them to both Marie or Denise. Is Angela answering any questions? Yeah, did you want to come up as well? Okay, perfect. Perfect. Yes, just at the back. Yes, go ahead.
I work for an organisation in Nova Scotia, that works with criminalised people, and due to the overrepresentation of black people in the criminal justice system, I'm director of housing, and we are growing fast within the housing sector. I want to, two things. One is, our policies were written by people who look like me 70 years ago. And I want to try and change the way the policies are written to incorporate language and to stop it becoming discriminatory. And I can't do that because I've got the same lens, but I'm trying to change it. This is why I'm here. I want to engage with people who can help do that. So I've got you a big presentation. So one is changing the policy to incorporate inclusivity, diversity, equity, so that we can look after those populations coming out of corrections that come through our doors, so that we can help them the best we can. That's part one. Part two is, how do we then develop our housing to allow people from the black communities to want to be there? So we've got two big projects. One is in Bridgewater and one is in Sydney. And they're both going to be coming 30 to 40 units, some singles, twos and threes. But we want to engage with organisations that can help us do that in a more mindful and inclusive way. Where do I start?
You want to start? And then we can take it.
Sure. First off, I mean, you've already started. Right. By acknowledging the discrimination that exists within the justice system that has led to an overrepresentation of Black Canadians in African diaspora. So you've already started, and you've already started by identifying our policies being discriminatory and how it lacks that lens. And what comes to mind is that's something that we have to do better in Canada is understanding what Black housing models, what Black homelessness, what Black experiences are, and how that can now inform the development of different housing models that's driven by the community. And I know Dagmar in Toronto has an organization that focuses on Black youth. And there's also Clive Grant, he was here, but he started looking at developing a housing, I think it's transitional housing for Black youth as well. So you're in a room that already has that knowledge, and we have Hogan's Alley as well here that supports folks that are experiencing housing challenges, and some of them are also Black. So we have those resources already in this room to have those conversations with and to learn about how they started that process and how is it going, and how do we amplify the voices and perspectives of Black individuals to be able to identify what their needs are. And I would say first process is engaging them, having them at the table, having them reviewing those policies, those practices, and identifying the gaps and the barriers and filling that. But it's very important that you bring them to the table and let them be the ones to lead the process. Thank you so much for being here.
I would also say,
Could I possibly get a copy of your poetry, those two that we read today? Is that possible?
I actually have a book that contains like the poetry that I wrote about living in the diaspora, and that's precisely the reason why, because of the work that we're doing. So I'm not here to plug, but since you asked, it's you can buy it anywhere books are sold. It's called Unspoken Truth, Unmuted and Unfiltered. And yeah, you can just look up my name. Unspoken Truth, Unmuted and Unfiltered.
I was also going to say that we're really passionate about permanent and perpetual housing. So if that's something that aligns with where you're going, I would say just be in touch with us on this flyer or this pamphlet. Our the contact is for our program coordinator, but you could get to myself or Angela. I think one of the things that we could easily, well, I don't want to use the word easily. One of the things we could do is an exchange in terms of, you know, I'm sure there's something you can help us think about when it comes to the clients you serve who may be moving or get ready for permanent housing. And I'm sure there's something we could do to help you have conversations with the various people that you're trying to serve, because nothing for us without us. So you may need someone, yep, you can clap for that. You may need someone who looks like us to have dialogue with those that you're serving to think about the policies that need to change. And then we need to take it back, as we had such a fine example, to them to say, is this what you were saying? Is this right? There may be a level of trust, compassion, and I'm going to use my favorite word, love, that you need us to help you to bridge the gap. We might also need your expertise as we think about permanent housing, because how can Down the Marsh, for instance, get some of the people to come down home and live and build a life, right? So that's my thought.
Wow.
Yeah? You're most welcome.
Yes, go ahead.
I actually have a question for each of you. So I work for the federal government in housing policy, and you gave a couple things that we can do to inform policy from equity serving groups, and one of them was to engage with communities. When we do that, for example, with certain First Nation communities, they have national organizations with which we can exchange to try to get some perspectives and apply them into our policies. If we were to do that, how would we even start? Is there somewhere, are there community organizations or groups that we can reach out to try to get a better understanding of their realities?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. One thing that comes to mind is, again, the challenge with that is there are Black organizations, there are groups. However, we need more. And we need more funding, given that your government, we need more funding, we need more resources specifically targeted towards these current Black organizations, but also targeted towards creating more organizations. Because when you look at, especially being in the field, you look at these organizations that are very mainstream and that have a one-size-fits-all approach to things. And working within Indigenous communities, you could tell that that does not work with Indigenous communities. And so throughout my career, I've seen Indigenous organizations come up to address those gaps, which has been incredibly inspirational. And so with Black communities, we need to start seeing that as well. And so we need to start engaging with these Black communities that currently are available, but also creating more Black communities to fill the gaps, because there are a lot of gaps. And so as a federal government, one thing that you could do, and a lot of us, not just the federal government, all of us, whether municipality, provincial, community organizations, is to help build that capacity, provide and allocate resources, support these organizations to better be equipped to meet those needs and support them. And so that's one of the main things as a federal government that you could do, is engage, but also provide resources and funding.
Thank you.
found that interesting because, when we're talking about Indigenous, they actually struck up, an urban, rural, northern Indigenous housing kind of group to speak specifically to the issue of housing for Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah.
So I think
That's exactly. I think it's also using that framework and looking at our Indigenous brothers and sisters to help guide us through that process. And because they're inspirational. I mean, I've been in the field for 15 years and I've seen what mainstream organizations, how the impact on racialized communities. And so now Black communities, especially with Black Lives Matter movement, we've started recognizing the systemic anti-Black racism that we're experiencing in Canada and how it's important to also have that culture appropriate services available.
Thank you. The question I had for you, so you talk about land trusts, and what I found interesting was the fact that you mentioned home ownership within those land trusts. And so I think in part that may be a departure from some of the bigger land trusts that we know about in the country. And I'm curious, how does that work? This may be a bit more.
No, it's actually a great question.
If you guys own the land, is it, for example, a 99-year lease on the land for whoever owns the home? I'm just trying to understand the context of how that's affected and what's the interplay between the community land trust owning the land and then those renting and owning homes on that land.
Okay. Just before I answer that, I would also mention the Black Planning Project, the Black Plan, Abigail Moria. I have so amazing young people in my life. I'm just over the moon right now. And I think that she might be somebody to have a conversation with, the Black Planning Project. And I know there's practitioners here that could point you in the right direction. Did you want to say something before I go on, or you're just the next question?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to give a plug into something.
Okay.
Yeah, in regards to, thank you guys so much for the presentations. They were just so informative. Thank you so much. So I am Dagmar. I am part of an organization called Red Center. We are one of the only Black-led organizations focused on homelessness around Black youth in the region. And I just wanted to say to the lady from the government, I think one of the things the government can do is really make some modifications to some of the tools that they use for reporting, because I think we spoke about data and how important it is and how there's a lack thereof, and we know that data informs policy. So case in scenario, I know Reaching Home is a funding that goes nationally across Canada to address homelessness, and we have benefited from Reaching Home. And one of the things that I think last year, when I looked at it, I'm like, why is this data reporting tool not giving us the ability to give specific numbers to Black youth or Black communities? And so this aggregated data is so important, and so that can be something that can be done. And I do not think it takes, that much of a thing to just tweak the reporting tool a little bit to give us the ability so that we will be able to see the gaps across the nation. So data, collecting proper data and ensuring that the instruments used for reporting give us the ability to report specifically on the communities that we serve can be a way to help.
Thank you so much. Give her some love. Thank you. Now back to your question about the land trust. One of the things, I had the privilege of going on a CLT tour in the States with Black practitioners from across our nation who are either have a land trust, like we were with Hogan's Alley, and they're one of the few land trusts that actually owns property and has built and has practicing. They're like our sheroes and heroes, right? And then across Canada, so we all went to the States. It's very important to know that the land trust model was started by Black people. And that the land trusts that we're seeing in Canada that are not African, Nova Scotian, African, Canadian, however you want to frame, are not actually totally functioning within the established or the set land trust model. So as we toured the States, we learned that you can, as an organization, own the land, let people buy the property, they can sell the property, they can pass it on intergenerationally, and as you educate, they can build wealth. So for us, it's about taking an Afrocentric approach to land trusts, doing what we do best, which is when we work together, we are for each other. And so whether it's a 99-year less, we use the word in perpetuity. In perpetuity. And we are going to fight for that fiercely. We're going to, we're new and we're working at it, but we're going to figure that out because it's one of our primary values. So I might not have the technical answers for you, but I learned yesterday in a storytelling workshop, I will not apologize and we will be fierce and it will happen, yes. Right? So I hope that happens.
So I work in housing for a municipality and I also am a real estate agent and I've been thinking about shared ownership and so the land trust is particularly interesting. But what I'm finding is difficulty in imagining low barrier access to ownership. So I'm wondering what you've thought about, rather than people coming up with $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 to become owners in your land trust model, or just in your imagining, what can that low barrier access to ownership look like?
So we would love to have you as part of our think tank on that. When we went on tour, one of the things, one of our favorite, I don't know if I should name them because you're not supposed to have favorites, but one of our favorite land trusts, weekly, they invite real estate agents, mortgage brokers, people who want to own a home, and they continue to educate on the model that together they've come up with. Now, the way they do things in the States is different than the way we do things here. Actually, even how people can lose their homes and all of that is a bit precarious. So we have to use our sister's model to work with the mortgage policy makers and real estate agents and mortgage brokers to effectively create models that work in the way that we need them to work. But with beautiful, smart people like yourself, I know that we can do that, but it's going to take us rolling up our sleeves and being proud Canadians and pushing, forcing, teaching our system to do what it's supposed to do. Everybody deserves a home. Everybody. So that's, I don't know if that's helpful, but I'd love to talk about it.
Yes, you at the back.
Hi, my name is Gary Johnson. I'm with the Preston Area Housing Fund in Nova Scotia, and I'm very proud of my people of rural. They're family members of all of us in Nova Scotia, and we are driving the same road, reaching out to build new homes in the community. I like the model for the land trust. We have a different model. We go after crown land to build new homes. But it's been an uphill struggle. But we know at the end of the day, we have a God that listens and that we will overcome. We need to be more connected to the federal government where there is more money. The provincial government has been very good to us, but we need the connection of the federal government to build more homes. And I think.
Thank you. Can I respond to that? When we talk about more money, I just want to point out that we have two amazing staff who we can't pay enough hours. We can't afford that. You know how grants are. We have to be thankful, so they tell us, but I can't stand grants for that. They target money. Oh, you can do the program. How are you supposed to do the program without the people? Yeah. I know that we all know that across the board. This is our capacity manager. Can I just be, yes. I have to be myself. They can't even get me in trouble. She only has 6 hours a week. Half of the conference is way over, so she's volunteering the rest. How is she supposed to do her work? And then we have our program coordinator. it's just, we need to work together. And in Nova Scotia, we need to come together. You know, there's this little money in the pot. You're tempted to fight for it. You don't want to tell each other about, it just makes it very messy. And so conferences like this, but also frank conversations, models, and accountability is the only way. And with election and things coming up, hey, let's push and come to the table so that the funding models that keep us poor are challenged, but and pushed back and changed. That's my thought. Yeah. Thank you.
You had a question?
I figured I'd just stand up and say hi since I've been referenced a few times.
Yes.
I am Siobhan. Yes, I am with Hope and Sally Society. Worked with Marie Cecile. We'll reference some of their work in our presentation later. Didn't realize this was the Black Room. We're going to be in here in the afternoon.
Oh.
Yes, it makes it easy.
I'll behave.
See? Just want to thank you all. Yes. This was beautiful. Just beautiful. I'm always so emotional about these things, just when you're thinking. And, you know, it is work. It is community. It's hard. What you're describing about 6 hours. I mean, there are so many land trust people that are not even being paid for the work that they're doing. Completely volunteer, right? How you gonna live? How you gonna live? You know? And you're up here and you're doing this work, and you're doing this presentation, you're bringing joy and hope and possibility.
We're the hope dealers.
Later, 3:30 in this room.
We'll be here.
We'll be presenting Black History Ottawa and speaking more specifically to displacement and its the legacy of homelessness that connects to what's been shared today and what we'll hear later. So I just want to stand up and say hello and thank you.
I just wanted to say that I really thank you so much for your presentation. I think it had a lot of uniqueness to it. Why I'm standing up is because I'm actually part of the Land Trust group, which is Little Jamaica. So
Yes. Anika.
We're doing a lot of work with the community members. So I really appreciate your presentation because there's so much that I learned that I'm going to be able to take back. And of course, the group will probably be getting in touch with you guys. We can kind of share our experience and work that we were doing. So
Thank you. When we went on tour, I got to know Anika very well, so just give her Rev's love. Yeah? Thank you. You guys are awesome. And I live in Toronto, but I'm working for Nova Scotia because that's my roots, and I'll do anything for Little Jamaica because, you know, Scotian and Jamaican, that's me.
With the Preston Area Housing. I'm the chairman of the Preston Area Housing in the Preston area, Nova Scotia. And I'm proud of you for what you have done so far, considering the fact that when they declared the Preston area as an area for, and made it established as a refugee area for Nova Scotia after sheltering. But the fact is that your families in Toronto, you're all linked with us in Preston. And what we're doing in our Preston area, we've been reclaiming, but we're in a different situation.
Yeah.
You were put in the marshland and hoping that you would die. We were put in the rockland.
Yes.
And that you would die. Amen.
Come on now.
And when we came, our people came over in the area, going back further than 1784. Our people, when I was doing the research and searching out and listening to one of the Halifax historian, Halliburton, he pointed out how our people came into this cold climate, coming from the south after the slavery was supposed to be eliminated. Well, they came and they barely had clothes. The government at that time, went for it, had to go to the army and request some clothes and ration in order to feed them. But our people were sent to the barren land, what they call the barren land. And we had nothing. They expected us to be dead by the time they returned to the fall. But thanks be to God.
Yes, go on.
Thanks be to God, they may not have been able to read and write, but they heard about the name Jesus. And kept the faith in the Lord, and then God provided the indigenous people, the Mi'kmaq. My community is built right in where the present area, the Mi'kmaq, the Rome, and all that area. And some of us are families, some of us are
Gabriel,
Mi'kmaq people. My great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather is part of the Mi'kmaq. But what happened is that we were on the land and it was them.
It's true.
Those indigenous people help our people to survive in the cold land. And when the government sent back their people to check out on what were the circumstances of the people that just landed there, they were surprised to find that many died, but there were the remnants. God kept us alive and we're still here. Now, like, we are striving in the housing that my executive director already told you what we're doing. But we're striving for even more. There is something I don't want to really say what it is, but we were given a certain thing that has not happened to us yet. You're looking for land, we got land, but somebody refused to honor what was given to us. And this is the problem that we have. There may be some more of you who may have been given land back by the British Crown. Way back in ancient time. And somehow they have been sweeping it under the mat. They don't want you to know, but I know because I did research and got information and knowing this. And there's so many acres of land that were given to us in the Preston area. And right now, I'm just saying, it really bugged me. I gave copy to certain people in the area that were leaders, that what we must do. And I'm getting so upset when I'm listening to this and looking at how it hurts. And upstairs this morning in the opening session, I couldn't help but thin tears of this young man talking about the trouble he went through and not having a home. Well, we got people that don't have home in our communities and who are struggling and is trying to get by some kind of way. But it hurts to know that we got land. But somebody refused to honor what was given unto us. When it says about land that was given to the people of Preston, who did not receive legal title during the time when they came. And it says given to us forever. And when it says forever, all the detail as to what was given to us is in there. We know what it is. And now I'm saying that we in our Preston area have to stand up and claim what is ours. And also be compensated for those who came in and took what belonged to us. There's a hymn that was made by somebody, take back what the enemy took from me, or not from the enemy, but some people came in and what belongs to us. And those who came in, the companies or whatever, they need to repay.
Reparations.
That belong to the people rightfully.
Thank you.
I want to tell you, keep on pressing. Because we're all in the same struggle. Whether you be black or white, I'm listening to companies, communities, talking about the homelessness. We're all suffering. And most of the people that are suffering is people who don't have nothing. Whether it doesn't matter what color you are, we're all struggling the same kind of issue. Keep on struggling, and my prayer will be for you.
I think I let someone in the back know just one final I think we have time for one final question, then we're going to wrap things up.
She's had her hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
So two final questions.
Two final questions.
Yay. Okay. So thank you for coming today, first of all. I I would like to ask you for a piece of advice as someone who's a lived experience expert, so has lived experience of homelessness, as someone who's a person of color, a daughter of an immigrant from India, and someone who's worked in the homelessness sector. And the piece of advice I'd like to ask you is around accountability, around being, and around disaggregated data and inclusion. What advice would you give to someone who feels it's not only their responsibility to represent people of color such as themselves in data, but also as an ally to Black communities, to Indigenous communities, but often receives the feedback of, oh, even though the numbers of inclusion of people of color, Black people, Indigenous people are so small in the studies, we still did a good job. We feel we did a good job. And even though that data is so small, working to pull it up, I've worked so hard to find that data online, and the quality of posing for Black communities is so low. The number of people affected who are Black by COVID is so high. And being told that, oh, that data is not relevant, what kind of advice would you give to someone who is working hard, putting emotion in to push back and say, yes, it is relevant, yes, we need higher numbers of inclusion, but a majority white dominant atmosphere, what advice would you give to me in order to try and keep pushing forward?
Such a good question.
Wow.
Such a good question.
You want to go ahead?
You go ahead. I'll be the pastor. He's a professor.
Oh, welcome to the club.
Yes.
Well, that's something that I've heard it so many times. And I hear the emotion in your voice because you feel so passionate about it. And first off, thank you for bringing that lens and bringing your voice, your presence, your knowledge, your expertise to the table to educate practitioners. A lot of the times when I'm said, well, when I'm told the numbers are so low, I say they're disproportionate to the population that exists, right? And that's what we have to be looking at is what is our what's the population, the general population, what's the number that we have there? And then what is it like in the justice system and things like that? That shows the overrepresentation. But I've found that it's so incredibly difficult to push these equity policies and practices and our perspectives in places and spaces that don't represent us and are not for us. But one thing I've found is finding that ally, creating those allyships with individuals that are in these spaces and having them champion it, of course, in collaboration with us. But I think bringing us together, being more organized. And we talk a lot about representation, and representation turns into tokenism, where we have one colored person and we say, well, that's it. There's representation there. That person becomes the spokesperson for everybody. But no, it's not fair. Exactly. I mean, so it's important to understand that we have to have an equal representation as to what we're seeing. If there's an overrepresentation, then we have to have those people at these spaces on this table, leading these projects, leading these initiatives. So coming together, finding out those allies and having you all in this room, go back, support the cause, push for changes. That's how we're going to ensure that we are creating an inclusive, equitable landscape for everyone to thrive.
Thank you. Now I can be myself, because that was real. That was important steps. But I would also say, as someone who's in the fight, you got to take care of yourself, right? Like, when you're in the fight and you're in the middle of the fire, you can feel isolated, you can feel alone, you could have the nervous breakdown that your work, I earned it your entire. So I would say to also find mentors and friends amongst, racialized groups so that you're not alone and by yourself. Right? Like find that, it is my personal joy to mentor many, particularly young women and men who are alone. So for instance, I live in Toronto, I'm serving Nova Scotia, and I'm here in Ottawa, and I have some university students that I will be having coffee with tonight who are here so that they're not alone. Find an elder or someone who will just listen to you and fight the good fight. And remember, it is a fight, but you are not alone. And I think all of us have to do that. Like we all feel like, oh, it's only me and it's so hard, and it is hard, but you are not alone. So don't give up in the midst of what you're doing. Thank you for your question.
And we're going a little bit over time, but I know that I promised someone in the back for one final question, then we'll wrap things up because I know everyone must be hungry for lunch.
I'll take a little fast. My name is Gowrie Russell. I work with the Canadian Council for Refugees. I know you've heard it a lot, but I want to repeat the appreciation and thanks, not just the panel, but all of you in the room. I feel we've had our minds and our hearts fed and full, and just want to honor that. I want to go rapidly because so much of what you said resonated, both about the battles we have within ourselves, but the stories you told about displacement of communities of African descent for generations, for hundreds of centuries, is so important for people to understand. And sadly, the kind of point that I wanted to also bring us to is how those cycles of forced displacement continue. So I work with frontline agencies supporting those claiming asylum in Canada who are fleeing persecution and danger, refugees from all over the world. And we know and have been working with our members to try and bring greater voice to this, but the way in which Black refugee claimants face particular challenges. And so this whole cycle of homelessness that has continued, and it's so important to think about homelessness also from homeland to land. So many things to think about. But this the right to asylum is accompanied by the right to have a home, the right to housing. And it is become a political football. We've all seen it in the community. We've seen mayors and street mayors all saying, who are these people and where are they from, and questioning. We said, really, I think so many people in Canada want to respond at the level of heart. These are people who have lost their home because they've had no choice. So the story of forced displacement that continues, the work that we've done with so many people, refugees and migrants of African descent, just honors your research about multidimensional. Once they come as refugees and migrants, they face systemic racism on all of these multiple ways. But the numbers of those homeless, and in this past year we had 2 die on the streets in the Greater Toronto area. So we are just keen to work with people in the housing sector and in other communities to bring voice to the rights of those, to the specific struggles faced by African refugees and migrants, to connect it to a broader story of systemic racism in Canada, to push for change, and that change that's required not just in the housing sector, but in our immigration and refugee policy. So I just want to say, if that's an issue that your organization is interested in, please come see me. I wanted to thank those of you that have put it in historical context, because the displacement and maltreatment of people of African descent, of course, is one, sadly, of centuries, but it's become a super real phenomenon in our cities right now. And we know the solutions. We actually know the housing solutions that refugee claimants need, because they have specific populations with specific needs, and there's investment that is available from the federal budget. But how is it being deployed, and how is it working with diaspora community organizations so that the solutions are in fact community rooted? So that is something that we're really keen to work on in the next year, pushing for investments in the community rooted housing solutions that will provide refugee claimants the support they need and the access to their rights with specificity to the needs of those of African descent. And thank you for your stories, for your poetry. And there is so much work to do, but I think we all feel a little stronger now to be able to go back out and do it because of this workshop. So.
I just want to thank the presenters again today and all of you for engaging in such a thoughtful discussion, and also for staying back a little bit. But yeah, just a final round of applause for the presenters.